The SWAT team broke into this guy's house, went into the basement, disconnected his servers from the internet, or, however they were connected to make these transactions. And they all carried these, servers up the stairs out into the SWAT truck, left the guy's property, and brought them to the company. Ever feel like your software project sucks? Like it could be the plot from a bad movie? Well, hopefully after you hear this story, you'll feel a little bit better. I'd been at this consulting company for about 7 years here in Austin. I've talked about it many times across episodes on the channel. But I was suddenly asked to meet with someone pretty high up in the company who had a new project for me to start. The project was on the East Coast, and I was actually going to have to fly up there to meet the client before we started. Wasn't really thrilled about that. Living here in Austin, I don't have to deal with the cold. It was the middle of winter, and so I went out and bought a winter coat for the first time in about 7 years since I'd moved at that point. You may have seen in some of my other episodes that orange kind of liner puffy jacket that I wore in earlier videos on the channel. That's the liner basically from this coat. But upon meeting with this guy, I found out that the sales executive at my consulting company, it was a woman who was involved in selling the project, had quit the company about 2 weeks before I started this project. And that should have been the first clear sign that there was a big problem coming. I also learned that another architect at the company had been involved in estimating the project. And as I've talked about in many other episodes on the show, estimating an entire project for another group of people that are going to actually deliver it is a really bad idea. So I got on a plane, flew up to the East Coast, and that night stayed in a hotel. In the morning, I woke up and I met with this manager who was going to be overseeing the project. He was involved with the sales process, and he was kind of the last person who was left available to be on the project after the saleswoman had left. But when we showed up at the client's offices, I remember looking outside at the building and thinking, this doesn't look like a business that we would do business with. And we walked up some kind of sketchy stairs, opened the door, walked inside, and suddenly I was met with what looked like, if you've seen The Sopranos, the back room for the Bada Bing, the strip club that they all worked at, it looked a lot like this. There was wooden paneling on the walls. It looked really sketchy. There were some kind of fake oil paintings hanging, boxes everywhere, and a few people on computers that obviously worked there but didn't look like they were real thrilled to be in the building. So I found out pretty quickly that the product we were going to be asked to build was for a man who owned this company, and apparently his dad was pretty rich and influential in this state on the East Coast. And there were some rumors I heard both during the project and afterwards that his dad was somehow involved pretty high up in the mafia. Now, I don't know if that was true or not, but some of the things that I saw and what I'm going to talk about in this story today, I kind of wonder if that may be partially true. The product was a hardware kiosk that was basically a way for people to charge their cell phones. You've seen all kinds of cell phone charging stations at, the airport all over the place. This was one for a particular market that I won't get into. I'm trying to keep this somewhat anonymous. But basically, this company had been given to this person by his dad, who was very powerful. So it was the first company he'd ever run. He kind of inherited the company, and he had this idea to build this cell phone charging hardware product. Well, the first really big sign that this was going to be a big problem project was we learned that they had existing hardware that was used across the country for a different purpose than charging cell phones. And this was what the majority of this company made its money from. And every time that people went to use these existing hardware devices, there was software on it. And when they would interact with the software, it had to process transactions. And those transactions were all processed in the basement of one person that used to work for their company and was fired. So think about it. This company, to just operate, to do business, all the money coming into the company, all of its transactions go through this one dude's basement, this ex-employee. And apparently after they fired him, they tried to get the code back. He wouldn't cooperate. So they were kind of being held hostage. Like the income of the company was dependent on this one guy who sort of had, all of their transaction processing in his basement. So we were given a zip file while we were there that they said, oh, this has the latest version of his code. We're going to need you guys to kind of reverse engineer it so that you can use it, because it's how we talk to all these suppliers that this new product that they wanted us to build, we're going to have to still integrate with. Well, the more I looked at the product they were asking us to build while I was there at the client site in the middle of winter, the more concerned I got. I started to look at all the requirements and all the screens and all the interfacing with hardware and software and third-party, tools. And I had heard that this project was supposed to take 3 months tops. And the more I was looking at it, I'd been in the industry at this point for about 15 years, something like that. I had this sinking feeling that, something is wrong about the way this project's been sold. So I told the other manager that was from my company at the client, who had flown up there with me to meet the client, my concerns. And he was like, yeah, don't worry about it. No, I had an architect involved. He spec'd it all out. There's, you're worried about nothing. It's going to be fine. And that was probably my first mistake. Leave me a comment if you have any ideas, by the way, as you hear this story today, about ways I could have gone about this better or things you would have done differently. Hindsight's 2020, but I'm always open to learn, right? The other thing that just filled me with dread was upon returning back to Austin, I learned this is going to be an agile project. And I'd been on one other agile project at the company so far, and that project got canceled because it was totally sold wrong. I did another episode on that where I talked about how I built a whole software product that never got built. The company paid for all this documentation, but they decided not to move forward with it. And the fact that, it was supposed to be agile, but the way it was sold was just totally screwed was the purpose of that. You can go back and listen to that as a podcast, watch that on the channel in my software project stories playlist if you want to check it out. But back in Austin, I learned that the team we were going to have was going to have me, 2 other developers. I was going to lead the project, a UX designer, and 1 QA professional who I'd worked with before. He was a good friend. On top of that, we were going to have an agile project manager who I learned had never done an agile project before. Now, he was a cool guy. Apparently his name was the same as some male porn star from the 80s. And we kind of joked with him all the time that he was that guy. And he was hilarious. He went along with it. It just became a running joke on the project. But, he knew this was his first agile project. He'd gotten some training. He'd gotten a certification. And I'd already been doing agile development at this point for, 10 or 12 years. And I was a little bit worried, like, okay, great, I'm getting managed by this guy who's never done this before. Even if I liked him, I was a little bit apprehensive being the lead of the project, but I wasn't actually going to be in charge of or able to necessarily influence managing it properly. So a big problem is, first of all, they told us we had 1 week to create user stories and then estimate all of them for this entire project. And remember, I'd already said a couple minutes ago that I was already concerned that this project was too big. So we did the best we could. We got together, the whole team, and we spent a whole week going through user stories, breaking it down into acceptance criteria, trying to estimate it the best we could, even though we didn't really agree with the approach. And after that week, we only really got about a third to a half way through all the features that, I had identified, at least talking to this other manager from my company, that we were going to build. I mean, essentially, this was a waterfall project. It was sold with a fixed bid to the client. They were told it would be done on a certain date. It would cost a certain amount, but they wanted us to use Agile. And really, those two things don't work. You can't give somebody a fixed bid and a fixed deadline and also call yourself Agile and adapt to change. It's just not compatible. So I had a real problem with this. And I had, luckily, a friend of mine who was pretty high up in the company, the consulting company I worked for, that I told immediately, immediately, hey, I have real problems with this project. I see it's got a lot of, dangerous aspects to it already. It seems like it's too big. I don't like the basically process that we're using. Help me reset expectations with this client. Well, after telling upper management about this, unfortunately, he kind of heard back from them. Well, sorry, we don't want to upset the client. We're just getting started. To have to tell them we have to change something this early in the project, it's going to lose confidence. And I get it. They didn't want to lose the project, but think about how short-sighted of a decision that is as a business. If you were in charge of a project that you're about to start and you find out as you're approaching the kickoff that major problems exist with the process that's about to be used, wouldn't it make more sense to put the project on hold, reset expectations, prevent a disaster from happening, and not just turn the other cheek, pretend everything's fine, and walk directly into the work as though nothing's wrong? Well, unfortunately, we did the latter. So the project kicked off at a Mexican restaurant here in Austin called Polvos. It's one of my favorite Mexican restaurants. They have these amazing fajitas there that this guy turned me on to the first couple years I lived in Austin. They're called like fajitas aguayo or something like that. And they're all these pecans and roasted peanuts and serrano peppers and guajillo peppers in it. And it's just the most amazing fajitas I've ever gotten anywhere else in Austin. If you're ever here, definitely check Polvos out and give that a try. You'll love it. But while we were there, the whole team came, had this, kickoff dinner with the client team. They had flown in from the East Coast, all the consultants, developers, the UX guy, the QA guy, the project managers, everybody was together. We had this big kickoff. And during that kickoff, the owner of the client's company kind of confided to me that he had taken Jimson weed in college and all these other crazy things he'd done. And, I've shared that, earlier in my career, in high school, I did a lot of drugs. If you watch my burnout video or again, listen to it as a podcast, I've got some stupid decisions I've made in my past, but I thought it was strange that, I barely knew this guy. And after a couple of drinks, he's telling me all these crazy stories about kind of wild stuff that he had done just a few years prior to owning this company. So we kicked off the project the next week and immediately hit our first big hurdle. We started to look at this code that was in the zip file, this Pascal code that they told us we needed to sort of reverse engineer. And as we started to look at it, we realized it wasn't code, it was the compiled binaries. Now, I wasn't a Pascal programmer and nobody on my team was, so we wouldn't have known this when the project was kicked off. But as soon as we reported this to our management, they put us in touch with a gentleman who was out of a different city, part of our consulting agency still, but he worked at a different city. I think he was out of San Antonio. We were in Austin. And so they had him kind of come into Austin and he started working with us each day. And his job was to, either decompile this Pascal code or figure out some way to implement the same functionality that it had. And this immediately added, a new big uncertainty to the project. If we're going to complete this project, not only is the scope too big, but we've got this critical component that depends on this Pascal code that we don't have access to. And so this person that they gave us, they have to basically infer or guess what the stuff's supposed to do based on what they heard about the product without having any code. Well, in the meantime, I started to hear back from the general manager of the consulting company I work from through, this person high up that I knew that I'd told I was really worried about the project, that we needed to spend a percentage of our time estimating the remaining user stories. So the idea was, hey, we heard that you're concerned, Jamie, that we haven't estimated this whole project. We're not going to reset expectations and fix the problems with it, but we'd like you to hopefully just estimate the remainder of the work so we can get a total cost of how long you think it's going to take. You'd think at that point they knew that there was a chance that once we estimate the whole thing, it's going to be longer than they originally sold it for. But we continue to do it. So every day we started to get together in a room, went through the remaining user stories and did the best we could. And at the end of that week, we only got about 2/3 of the project estimated. There was still another week probably worth of just estimating as a team and breaking down the work till we could give them a final estimate. Well, this consulting firm I worked for, they were a Microsoft partner, and most of the code I did at that point, there was some JavaScript and Ruby on Rails and stuff like that, things in the cloud. But at this time, C# was sort of the primary language that most of the developers, the other consultants used. And so I was supposed to build us a base architecture in the first week, basically put together an initial project, loaded up with some libraries and patterns that I'd had experience with that I knew were probably going to go over pretty well. Well, this not being a web application, this was going to run on some hardware. I selected WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation. It was going to run on some hardware that could run an embedded version of Windows. So we got started with it. We kind of did a quick prototype where we just created like the base app. It did nothing but said hello world with this architecture, saw if we could deploy it to the hardware and at least get it to come up. And we knew it could. So we knew at least, that the framework would run on there and that the technology I'd selected would technically work. And that first week on the project, it went so well. The two other developers I worked with really enjoyed working on the code. I really enjoyed working on the code. The patterns I put in place, everybody learned them super fast. We were making incredible progress, but still we couldn't really get it to do anything with the hardware. That was dependent on this Pascal code. Well, after this first week of coding and feeling like we'd made a ton of progress, we were supposed to do a demo meeting with the client. And the client flew in from the East Coast down to Austin. They were staying there. They met with us. We did a demo. We showed them everything we'd built. And what was cool was at that point, we actually got some of the hardware integration to work. The person from San Antonio that was working with our team had not found a way to reverse engineer the Pascal code, but they had found a way through .NET to kind of talk to the hardware and get some things to work that we could then demo through the app. And the client was thrilled. In the meeting, they were telling us how good of a job that we did. They were laughing. It seemed like, everything was going great. But the next day, we found out that right after that meeting, the client met privately with the manager that I had flown up to the East Coast to meet with the client with, that was kind of involved in sales, this manager that'd been there from the beginning from my consulting firm. And the client was pissed off and really worried and didn't think that we'd gotten as far as we should, thought that the project was at risk already after a week of work. Now, there was some work we had done prior to that week, still related to coding and getting things going, but this was really our first solid week. And, that demo we were all depending on across the whole team, that we were going to set this good example with the client. And as soon as we found out that things were a problem, suddenly that caused all kinds of things to change on the project. First, the other two developers on my team were immediately pulled off the project and told to work on other projects. And I was like, oh, this is going to be bad. And the next morning, I found out that the agile project manager on our team, the one named after the 80s porn star that we were joking about, had been fired. And I'm talking to him over LinkedIn and trying to find out what happened. And basically there was a backroom meeting at my consulting company between a bunch of the leadership, and they were being sued. So the client threatened to, well, they hadn't sued them yet, but they threatened to sue them for, a contract for how much it was going to take to build the project, and feeling like we weren't going to get it done in time. So all of a sudden we were in the threat of legal action. They have this backroom meeting, a whole bunch of the leadership from my company, from my consulting company, and they're demanding this manager, tell us how long it's going to take. Tell us how long it's going to take. And he's like, I don't know. We need more time to estimate the rest of the user stories. You knew this. We don't have time, to do it yet. We haven't had time to do it yet. And they're like, tell us how long it's going to take. Tell us how long it's going to take. And he's like, I don't know. $2 million. And they go, you're fired. And they just fired him on the spot for giving them a number that they didn't like, because I think the project had been spec'd out to be like $300,000 or $280,000. So the moment that they heard that this project they sold was really going to be $2 million, they just had an emotional reaction, flipped out, blamed this manager, and fired him. Well, what happened next was I was suddenly put in touch with a VP of my company way high up who basically told me, hey, Jamie, from now on, what we're going to need you to do is we need you to spend every day and on the weekends, no matter what it takes, to get us out of this lawsuit, we need you to create a specification document. It's got to describe everything you know about the software. You need to design all the screens. You need to talk about what all the components are that need to be built. You need to include, testing aspects of it. They put me in this crazy spot where suddenly I alone as the lead with no help from anybody else was being expected to spec out and basically, create basically a piece of ammunition for them that they could go back to the client and go, look, I'm sorry that you're upset, but this is proof right here. This project is way too big. We can't just give this to, this big project for the original price. And the VP gave me this spreadsheet and he's like, yeah, this will help you with estimating. Apparently you guys need help with estimation. And honestly, I was kind of insulted because I was, again, about 15 years into my career at this point. I was like, gosh, I've estimated tons of projects, but whatever. I tried not to get pissed off at him about it. And I reminded this VP, hey, I've been trying to tell people this project was scoped wrong. It was estimated wrong. It was sold wrong. We got into this position and I've tried to raise awareness at the company from the beginning that this is a problem and I keep being ignored. Nothing's being done about it. And he said, yeah. I heard about that. I already know that. Just continue what we're asking you to do. Just estimate it. There will be time to talk about what went wrong later. So I had to make tons of guesses about what the product even needed to do. Because this was agile, there were things that had been mentioned between the owner of this company and our team that were never fully agreed on. The user stories had not all been completed. So I was under a ton of pressure. I couldn't talk to the client because, again, there was the threat of this lawsuit. They wouldn't let me talk to the manager who I'd met, that I'd flown up to the East Coast with. So I started to feel like they were kind of setting me up for a disaster to take the fall. And what really started to sort of freak me out was all of a sudden one day I get this email that says, hey, Jamie, we've brought in an architect from another city, from San Antonio, who I don't know, who's going to audit your code base. We just want to make sure, that there wasn't maybe a problem with the architectural decisions that were made. So again, they're looking for someone to blame, someone that can take the fall for this project going wrong. And so I'm freaking out, I'm really stressing out over the next couple of days. My wife's like, just like, dude, you got to just try to chill and, wait and see what happens. But I'm swearing, I'm stressed, I'm upset. I'm riding my bike like crazy to try to, get rid of the stress. And so the next day, this gentleman who I didn't know from San Antonio, this other architect that worked for our company, did this 3-hour deep dive on our code base with me. And I went through all the patterns, the, technologies that were selected, everything. And at the end of it, he was like, okay, well, I'll let you know how things, go. And so I'm freaking out, of course, for about a day. But eventually I hear back through this email that he apparently told management, the architecture looks great. Jamie made great decisions. He selected, exactly what I would probably do. It was totally fitting for the project. And thank God I dodged a huge bullet there. Well, eventually I finished the estimate and I delivered it to him. And the ultimate number that I came up with, $2.2 million. Just a little bit more than the $2 million that the manager who was fired told our leadership internally that they let him go for. And once I told this to the other developers and the other people who were on the project, who had all been pulled off at this point, we all just kind of laughed about it internally, like, man, this sucks. And I reached out to that project manager who had gotten a new job, luckily, and kind of told him what happened. And he was laughing about it too. Like, wow, I can't believe they fired me for, just pulling the number $2 million out of my butt. And basically that was the estimate. So pretty soon I was put on a different project, and I heard kind of through the grapevine at my company that the client of this project that I went through all this drama with had finally dropped the lawsuit. Apparently, they were presented with my specification in another one of these backroom meetings between the client and my company. And once they saw the specification, I think this was like a 48-page spec I had to create. And they also saw the breakdown of the estimate and the numbers. They kind of came to their senses and realized, well, we can't expect this consulting company to just eat over $1 million because of a, misspec'd project. And they dropped the threat of a lawsuit, and just, my client and my company decided to part ways and not do business anymore. Well, about a month later, everybody who was part of this project, me, the developers, the UX designer, the manager, all these people, we were called into a meeting. And we all showed up in the meeting, and there was one of those conference phones in the middle of the conference room where, somebody can call in and talk and everybody can hear them. And the VP from my company called in and basically was like, all right, this is a chance where we can talk about, what went wrong with the project. And everybody was like, great, we can finally have kind of a project post-mortem. We can talk about how it was sold wrong. We can talk about how we raised visibility and changes didn't happen. And before anybody got to talk, he goes, yeah, guys, how you have timesheets that you have to fill out every week? And we're all like, yeah, definitely. Well, he's like, there's a text box in there that says, are there any issues you're aware of the project? If so, put them here. Nobody on the project let us know about this problem. Nobody filled out the timesheet in any of the weeks that you were working on this project across the entire team to raise awareness to the leadership that there was a problem. So the systemic breakdown that occurred on this software project was your failure to communicate the problem through your timesheets. And we all looked at each other around the room like, holy shit. We couldn't believe that this VP, who I'd already talked to, who had said they were aware of me raising awareness of the problems, who knew about how I was concerned that it was sold wrong, had basically decided to blame our entire team for the reason why they got in trouble with the project. And so basically he ends the meeting by going, so, let's just move forward. We've got other projects to work on. There's really nothing to be gained by continuing to be frustrated about this project. I know we all hoped it would turn out differently, but let's move on. Thank you. And just hangs up. And so we get out of the call and we're all just kind of, again, laughing at the ridiculousness of the situation. But internally, man, I was so frustrated and hurt. And this is one of the projects that ultimately fueled the fire, so to speak, of my nervous breakdown about 1.5 years later, where I lost my job. I lost all my money. I started this YouTube channel. This is what I've talked about in my burnout episode. And this just became a really pivotal negative event in my career. Well, the one funny thing about all this that we heard, a few months later through the grapevine, so to speak, again, through various consultants that were talking to people that knew other contexts that worked at the client, was they heard that apparently this client knew the local police chief for this small county that this kind of sketchy company worked out of. And they had convinced them to take the SWAT team to this guy's house who had all their code for their transactions in the basement. And the SWAT team broke into this guy's house, went into the basement, disconnected his servers from the internet, or, however they were connected to make these transactions. And they all carried these, servers up the stairs out into the SWAT truck, left the guy's property, and brought them to the company. And I thought, I've heard a lot of things in my career, a lot of wild stories, but calling the SWAT team to go collect your servers is got to be one of the craziest ones. So the moral of this story, well, sometimes you just do the best you can and you watch things fall apart and you try to cover your butt. You try to be ethical. When I had them calling the architect on me, I was like, man, if I get blamed for this just because of some bad call about the architecture, that's really going to suck. It's not going to be fair. I had to do all that overtime, all those weekends estimating, this giant project for several weeks. Well, I couldn't work with anyone else. That felt really unfair to me. But at the end of the day, it was like, hey, this is my job. I'm a lead. This is my responsibility. And once I got clean and as I've talked about in my burnout episode, I kind of, found Jesus Christ and changed sort of the way that I look at work. I tried the best I could to just go, well, I can either flip out, be angry, and just try to like blame all these people, or I got to find a way to just move forward in my career. So, are you at a place in your career where you've had some crazy stuff happen to you? Is this story bringing up anything for you? What are some situations that you've been in where maybe management hasn't treated you well? You've had clients behave kind of strangely. Leave me some comments because, I think if there's one thing that we can all do, we can try to share with each other the difficult projects we've been on first, just so that we know we're not alone. And then on top of that, we can start to ask ourselves, if this is the way that sometimes people in power behave, when is the appropriate time for us to say, hey, enough is enough? We've worked for corporations. We've tried to cope with the tech industry in the way that some crazy people at the top of these top tech companies behave, and get the courage to take the next step towards hopefully starting our own company or finding some sort of entrepreneurial pursuit to be the way that we make money going forward. And that's really ultimately what I had to do about 7 years ago. It's been a long journey, but today I'm able to coach people and I'm able to make these episodes and I'm able to help people. And that never would have happened if I didn't have bad project after bad project, and finally come to a place where I was really forced to change the way that I work. So until next time, thanks.